There's a moment in every conversation where you feel it coming, that familiar pressure in your chest, that slight defensive tension in your shoulders. Someone asks about your life choices, your beliefs, your way of being in the world, and before you even realize it, you're launching into an explanation. Not because they demanded it, but because you've been trained to provide it. You explain why you chose that career, why you ended that relationship, why you believe what you believe, why you live how you live. And Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who spent his life dismantling the comfortable lies we tell ourselves, would watch this reflexive self-justification with a mixture of pity and frustration, because he understood something most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. Your need to explain yourself is a symptom of a disease, the disease of needing others' approval to validate your own existence. Listen to how often you explain yourself in a single day, not just in big conversations about life decisions, but in tiny moments. Why you ordered that coffee, why you're taking a different route home, why you're reading that book, why you feel how you feel. You've become a walking explanation, a constant broadcast of justifications for actions that need no justifying. And the most insidious part? Half the time, no one even asked. You're explaining preemptively, defensively, automatically, as if your right to exist depends on others' understanding and approving of your choices. Nietzsche lived in an era drowning in explanations. The 19th century was obsessed with rational justification. Everything had to be explained through science, morality, progress, or God. Everyone needed reasons for everything, cosmic permission slips for their own lives, and Nietzsche saw through it all like looking through glass. He recognized that this compulsive need to explain ourselves comes from a fundamental insecurity about our right to exist as we are. It comes from what he called slave morality, the mindset of people who need permission to be themselves. No one can construct for you the bridge upon which precisely you must cross the stream of life. No one but you yourself alone. Yet, listen to how we live. Every significant decision becomes a committee meeting where we present our case to friends, family, society. Every life choice needs to pass through filters of acceptability, reasonableness, normalcy. We've turned our existence into a perpetual job interview where we're always selling ourselves, always pitching our lives as worthy of approval. But worthy to whom? And why do their opinions matter more than your own experience? The people who demand explanations from you really listen to who they are. They're usually the ones who've never questioned their own paths, who followed the scripts handed to them without examination. Your unexplained life terrifies them because it suggests that choice is possible, that the scripts aren't mandatory, that they could have lived differently. They need you to explain yourself so they can find the flaw in your reasoning, the error in your logic, the reason why their conformity was actually the smart choice. Your freedom is their accusation, and they need you to justify it so they can dismiss it. Think about the last time you felt that compulsive need to explain yourself. Maybe someone questioned your career that doesn't follow the traditional ladder. Maybe they wondered about your relationship that doesn't fit the standard mold. Maybe they challenged a belief that diverges from the mainstream. Remember how you marshaled your arguments, presented your case, tried to make them understand, and remember how, even when they nodded and said they got it, you felt somehow diminished. That's because explanation is diminishment by nature. It takes something irreducibly complex and personal, your life, and tries to compress it into digestible concepts for others' consumption. One must shed the bad taste of wanting to agree with many. But this bad taste has been cultivated in you since birth. From your first day in school, you learned that having the right answer mattered less than being able to explain it. You were trained to show your work, justify your conclusions, make your thinking transparent to authority. What they didn't tell you is that this training in explanation is actually training in subordination. It teaches you that your choices are only valid if others can understand and approve of them. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, often translated as overman or superman, has nothing to do with genetic superiority or domination over others. It's about becoming someone who has overcome the need for external validation, who creates values rather than inheriting them, who lives from their own center rather than from others' expectations. The Übermensch doesn't explain, because explanation implies that someone else's understanding is necessary for your choices to be valid. It implies that you're asking permission to be who you are. But listen to yourself. You're still caught in what Nietzsche called the herd mentality. Not because you're weak or stupid, but because the social conditioning runs so deep you mistake it for reality. You explain yourself because you've been taught that being understood equals being good, that justification equals righteousness, that if people just understood your reasons, they'd approve. But Nietzsche saw the trap in this thinking. You're making your existence contingent on others' comprehension. You're giving them veto power over your life. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. And the tribe's most effective weapon isn't force, it's the demand for explanation. Explain why you're not following the expected path. Explain why you don't want what everyone wants. Explain why you think differently, feel differently, choose differently. Explain until you're so exhausted from explaining that conformity seems like relief. The tribe doesn't need to force you to conform if it can exhaust you into compliance through endless demands for justification. Here's what Nietzsche understood that most miss. You don't owe anyone an explanation for your existence. This isn't rudeness or narcissism. It's the foundation of authentic living. Your life choices don't require a doctoral defense. Your beliefs don't need peer review. Your way of being in the world doesn't need to be approved by committee. The moment you accept that you need to explain yourself, you've already agreed that others have jurisdiction over your life. But let's be precise about what not explaining yourself actually means in practice. It doesn't mean being unaccountable for actions that harm others. It doesn't mean refusing to communicate in relationships. It doesn't mean becoming a hermit who rejects all social interaction. It means recognizing the crucial difference between necessary communication and unnecessary justification. It means knowing that "because I choose to" is a complete sentence. It means understanding that your life is not a debate where you need to convince the opposition. The surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently. Yet listen to how explanation enforces conformity. No one asks you to explain why you want a conventional life, marriage, house, career, retirement. It's only when you deviate that explanations are demanded. This reveals that explanations aren't really about understanding. They're about policing the boundaries of acceptable difference. They're about making sure your deviation isn't too extreme, your authenticity isn't too threatening. Consider the sheer energy you spend on explanations. Not just the actual conversations, but the mental preparation, the imaginary arguments where you defend your choices to critics who exist only in your head. The constant editing of your life story to make it more palatable, more understandable, more reasonable. You're living your life as a rough draft, always ready for revision based on others' editorial comments. But your life isn't a manuscript seeking publication. It's a lived experience that justifies itself by being lived. Listen to what happens in your body when you feel compelled to explain yourself. The tension, the slight acceleration of heart rate, the mobilization of defense. Your body knows you're in a fight, even if it looks like a casual conversation. You're fighting for your right to exist as you are, and the very fact that you feel you need to fight reveals how deeply you've internalized the belief that your existence needs justification. Nietzsche recognized that the most profound truths can't be explained anyway. Can you really explain why you love whom you love? Can you articulate why certain experiences move you to tears? Can you justify the deepest callings of your soul in terms others would understand? The most important things in life exist beyond explanation. They can only be lived, felt, experienced. When you try to explain them, you're not clarifying, you're diminishing, reducing the irreducible to fit in the small container of others' understanding. To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. But notice, he doesn't say to explain the suffering or to justify the meaning to others. The meaning you find is yours alone. It doesn't need to be rational, conventional, or explicable to anyone else. It only needs to be real to you. Yet you keep trying to make your personal meaning universal, to translate your individual experience into general terms others can accept. In doing so, you betray the very personal nature of meaning itself. The tragedy Nietzsche saw everywhere is that most people are so busy explaining their lives that they forget to live them. They're so concerned with how their choices appear to others that they stop making choices from their authentic center. They become performers in their own existence, always aware of the audience, always ready with explanations for every act. But life isn't a performance, or if it is, you should be the only audience that matters. You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the correct way, and the only way, it does not exist. Listen to the liberation in these words. When you truly absorb this truth, the compulsion to explain evaporates. You're not doing it wrong, you're doing it differently. Different doesn't require justification. Different justifies itself by existing. The only person who needs to understand you're different is you. But here's where it gets challenging. When you stop explaining yourself, people will create their own explanations for you. They'll assume, project, misinterpret. They'll construct narratives about your motivations that have nothing to do with reality, and every fiber of your socially conditioned being will want to correct them, to explain, to set the record straight. This is the test. Can you let them be wrong about you? Can you value living your truth more than being understood? Can you choose authenticity over accuracy in others' perceptions? Listen to how Nietzsche lived this principle. He was one of the most misunderstood philosophers in history, and he knew he would be. He wrote, "Some are born posthumously," meaning his ideas would only be understood after his death, if ever. Yet he kept writing, thinking, living according to his own values without diluting them for mass consumption. He chose being authentic over being understood, being real over being relatable. The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. When you stop explaining yourself, you soar. But to those still grounded in conventional thinking, you'll appear strange, arrogant, incomprehensible. That will demand you come back down to their level, explain yourself in terms they can grasp. But why should you clip your wings for those who choose not to use theirs? Why should you translate your flight into pedestrian terms? This isn't about superiority or contempt for others. It's about recognizing that everyone has the capacity to live without explanation, to author their own values, to exist on their own terms. But most choose the comfort of conformity over the discomfort of authenticity. They'd rather be understood than be themselves. And they need you to make the same choice to validate their own. Your unexplained life is a mirror reflecting their unexplored possibilities. Listen to what happens when you actually stop explaining. That job interview where they probe about unconventional choices, that's what I chose to do, is a complete answer. That family gathering where relatives demand to know why you're not following the prescribed path. Because I'm not is sufficient. That social situation where someone needs you to justify your lifestyle, it works for me, is all that needs to be said. Not defensively, not aggressively, but simply, finally, without elaboration. The internal shift is even more profound. When you stop explaining yourself to others, something amazing happens. You stop explaining yourself to yourself. You stop needing rational reasons for every impulse. You stop requiring your life to make logical sense. You allow contradictions, embrace paradoxes, accept that you are larger and more complex than any explanation could capture. You become comfortable with being a mystery, even to yourself. I am not a man. I am dynamite. Nietzsche wrote this not as arrogance, but as description. When you stop explaining yourself, you become explosive. Not in the sense of destroying others, but in the sense of breaking through the boundaries that explanation creates. You become unpredictable because you're no longer constrained by the need to make your actions understandable. You become truly free because you're no longer performing freedom for an audience. Listen to what the world actually needs: more unexplained lives, lives that demonstrate rather than explicate, lives that embody rather than justify, lives that show alternative ways of being simply by being them, without the footnotes of explanation. When you live without explanation, you give others permission to do the same. Your unexplained existence becomes a gift, showing others that it's possible to live without constantly defending your right to exist. But this path is fundamentally solitary. No one can validate your choice to stop seeking validation. No one can approve your decision to stop seeking approval. No one can understand your choice to stop seeking understanding. The moment you look for external confirmation that it's okay to stop explaining yourself, you've already failed. This is the ultimate self-reliance, not just doing it yourself, but being yourself without annotation. What does not destroy me makes me stronger. Every time you resist the urge to explain, you build strength. Every time you let misunderstanding stand rather than rushing to correct it, you develop power. Every time you choose authenticity over approval, you forge character. The strength isn't in being understood, it's in being misunderstood and continuing anyway. It's in letting others' confusion about you be their problem, not yours. Listen to the fear that arises when you consider actually doing this. The fear of being judged, rejected, isolated. The fear that if people don't understand you, you'll be alone. But Nietzsche would point out that you're already alone. You're just hiding it behind explanations. True connection doesn't come from being understood intellectually. It comes from being recognized essentially. And that recognition doesn't require explanation. It requires presence, authenticity, the courage to be seen without interpretation. The paradox Nietzsche reveals is this: when you stop explaining yourself, you become more understandable, not through words but through being. Your life becomes a coherent expression of who you are, rather than a fragmented collection of justified compromises. People might not understand your individual choices, but they'll understand that you're someone who makes their own choices. They might not grasp your particular values, but they'll grasp that you have values. They might not get your specific path, but they'll get that you're walking your own path. Become who you are. But you cannot become who you are while constantly explaining who you are. Explanation requires translation, and every translation is a betrayal. You cannot translate yourself into others' terms without losing something essential. The more you explain, the further you drift from your source. You become the explanation rather than the person, the justification rather than the life, the defense rather than the existence. So here's Nietzsche's challenge made practical. Can you go through one day without explaining yourself unnecessarily? Can you make choices without defending them? Can you state preferences without justifying them? Can you be who you are without apologizing for it? Can you exist without asking permission? Start small if you need to. Stop explaining your food choices. Stop justifying your weekend plans. Stop defending your taste in music. Build the muscle of unexplained living. Because here's the final truth. Your life is not an argument that needs to win. It's not a hypothesis that needs proof. It's not a defendant that needs acquittal. Your life is a fact. It exists. It doesn't need to justify its existence any more than a tree needs to explain why it grows toward the sun. The tree just grows. You just live. The explanation is in the living, not in words about the living. Listen to yourself after you finish with these words. Will you feel the need to explain why you spent time with them? Will you justify to yourself or others why this mattered or didn't matter? Will you translate this experience into acceptable terms for others' consumption? Or will you simply let it be what it was, an encounter, a possibility, a moment of recognition or rejection that needs no explanation beyond its own occurrence? Nietzsche is long dead. He can't explain his philosophy to you. He can't justify why you should stop justifying yourself. But his unexplained life continues to detonate through time, affecting those ready to be affected, changing those ready to be changed. Not through explanation, but through example. Not through justification, but through existence. Not through making himself understood, but through being incomprehensibly himself. Your unexplained life is waiting, not as a destination, but as a possibility. Not as an achievement, but as a release. Not as something to attain, but as something to stop preventing. The door is open. No one's asking you to walk through it. No one's asking you to explain why you would or wouldn't. And that silence, that absence of demand for explanation, that's where your real life begins. In the space where you stop translating yourself for others and start being yourself. In the moment where you realize that because is not required after I am. Listen to that silence. That's the sound of your authentic life, waiting to be lived without explanation, without apology, without permission. That's the sound of freedom,